As you've heard from coalition senators, this bill is not going to be supported. And I do want to associate myself with all of those remarks that have been made last night and this morning by coalition senators. Because many people might be hearing it on the radio, they wouldn't be able to see what is happening in the chamber. And I think it's also important to note that earlier in the night we heard contributions from the Greens. In actual fact, the Greens have spoken more frequently on this bill than government senators have. And that is quite remarkable, given that it is the government's bill that we're talking about tonight. But as I said, the bill will not be supported by coalition senators, but of course it is important to acknowledge that the coalition is committed to transitioning to net zero emissions in a way that is responsible and protects the growth and prosperity of Australia. It's important to restate as well that the coalition exceeded Australia's Coyote targets, signed Australia onto achieving net zero by 2050 and reduced emissions by over 20% on our 2005 base level, putting Australia well on track to beat our Paris Treaty commitments. And of course, under the coalition government, emissions were reduced at rates faster than some of our most important trading partners. But at the core of this debate, the Senate is being asked to embrace a reform initiative that has not been properly modelled. What does that mean? The effects of the legislation are unknown on the economy, and what we're saying is that in that unknownness there's a risk, and you can only plan for the worst. This reform in this bill is unbalanced, and its immediate impacts will be felt disproportionately by regional communities across Australia. And for other Australians, they will not escape the consequences. For them, this reform will be felt in further price increases for Australians, as the additional costs of delivering the required emissions reductions will be passed on to Australian households. Critically, the Treasury confirmed its Senate estimates in February that modelling of the safeguard mechanism reforms had not considered broader economic impacts, such as the impact on investment, the impact on jobs and the impact on prices. In addition to that, the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water also declined to provide senators the economic modelling that was undertaken to fashion this initiative. And where information about costs have been available, they've been revealing. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry confirmed business would pass their higher operating costs under this safeguard mechanism on to consumers. This is a very real cause of concern and alarm. This is a bad idea happening at possibly the worst time for the Australian economy. At a time when Australia needs to be talking about the next tranche of reforms to protect our living standards, to protect this country from becoming poorer, what we're being dealt with is a market intervention so severe that it will leave a lasting scar on many Australian industries. This bill will make Australian businesses less competitive compared to our international competitors. It's true that the previous coalition government had introduced a safeguard mechanism to limit the growth of emissions in the industrial sector by applying an emissions baseline on 215 of Australia's largest emitters. That reform delivered emissions benefits, but Labor's plan is not the same as the previous coalition government's plan. Claims that this safeguard mechanism policy mirrors the coalition is designed to confuse and to mislead. The new government safeguard mechanism will force facilities to reduce their emissions intensity by up to almost 5% each year, regardless of whether the technology exists for them to do so. Without access and pathways to technology, there can be no pathway to decarbonisation of the Australian economy. Instead, many Australian businesses will have no option but to reduce production, move offshore or shut down entirely. That amounts to declining economic growth, lower levels of productivity and a fall in real incomes and living standards for every Australian. This so-called safeguard mechanism will be felt in the daily lives of many Australians. Higher building material costs in the middle of a housing affordability crisis, higher fuel costs in response to rising energy bills, higher transportation costs that will hit our supply chains. Australia's strength can be easily turned into a vulnerability when put in the hands of the ill-informed. As an open economy and an export-orientated trading nation, reforms such as this should be embarked upon with great care, a much deeper understanding of their consequences and a proper awareness of the drivers of our domestic and international competitiveness. Concerns this reform may risk closing down Australia's cement, steel, aluminium, oil refining and mining industries have been met with disbelief by some people in the community and some senators in this chamber. But just this evening, the first ripples of the economic repercussions of the so-called safeguard mechanism have been revealed. In this morning's papers, senators will be able to read how Australian coal companies have warned of a carbon tax by stealth, confirming that this safeguard mechanism will drive up energy prices, destroy jobs and kill foreign investment. Companies that employ thousands of Australians, such as Whitehaven, New Hope, Bowen Coking Coal and Peabody Australia, have all condemned this 11th hour, perhaps it's the 12th or 13th hour now, 11th hour safeguard mechanism shake-up amid concerns the changes will damage prosperity and make it harder and more expensive to reduce emissions. These are the same companies that are custodians of $15 billion worth of projects and count billions of dollars in their investment pipelines. They say the government's proposed amendments will make Australia uncompetitive, and that means making Australians poorer. The President of Peabody's Australian operations, Jamie Francombe, has said this legislation makes the mining industry less competitive at a time when it's integral to providing the minerals and energies required for the energy transition. Goes on to say the very real danger in setting aspirational emission reduction targets and imposing rigid rules to achieve them is that it will reduce our competitiveness, lead to potential job losses and hurt regional communities. Glencore has said the reforms needed to achieve emissions reductions are needed without destroying the jobs and without destroying the investments that are critical to our national economy. And the future owners of Origin Energy have said the government must better balance the need to reduce emissions while ensuring energy security. They've said if we don't get the balance right and we have the extreme volatility like we saw in Europe last year, I think you're going to get very significant consumer backlash. Consumer backlash. They are the two words that government senators should keep in mind. At the last election, Labor did very well in Western Australia, and congratulations to them. But to borrow Senator Scarr's term, West Australians did not vote for this. And when you look at some of the projects that are on the list of 212 liable entities, these are names of projects that are household names in Western Australia. Let me just read some of them to you. Hamersley Iron Projects at Hope Down 1, Hope Down 4, Brockman 4 Mine, Brockman 2 Mine. On the list is the Pilbara Rail Operations. On the list is the Alinta Energy Transmission Unit at Roy Hill. On the list is the Newmont Tanami operation. On the list is the Yilgarn Iron Ore Project in Coolinobbing. On the list are the BHP Iron Ore projects. On the list is CSB Limited at the Kwinana facility. On the list is the BP refinery at Kwinana. On the list is the Adbri Limited Ndongra and Coburn operation. These are projects that are going to suffer as a result of the safeguard mechanism, and not 12 months ago West Australian voters put their trust in Patrick Gorman, the member for Perth, Tracy Roberts, the member for Pearce, Zanita, whose name escapes me, the member for Swan, Sam Limintangni. So Patrick Gorman, the member for Perth, Tracy Roberts, the member for Pearce, and Ali, the member for Cowan, must now go and front their communities in suburbs like Clarkson and Merriwa and Morley and Bassendean and explain to West Australian families who have benefited from well-paid jobs flying up and out of the Pilbara region of our state, why is it that their jobs will soon be at risk? Not my word, the words of industry themselves. Why will their jobs soon be at risk at a time when they're feeling mortgage pressure, at a time when they're feeling rising cost of living pressures? A bad idea being introduced at the worst possible time. So why is it then that only one Labor senator, Senator Grogan, had the courage to come into the Senate and stand up and make a contribution on this bill? I have not heard one WA Labor senator come in here and say this is a good idea for WA families, that they have not broken the trust of West Australian voters, not yet 12 months since the first anniversary of the government. And at the core of this is not just WA's prosperity, not just the prosperity of West Australian families, but the prosperity of the whole country. This is remarkable. And it's a shame that more people are not watching the television, because here are Labor senators who have made little to no contribution. The Greens did all the speaking and they've gone home. And you're left carrying the can. Wow, you have been really, really outdone by the Australian Greens. When we come back to this chamber in just a few hours' time, I'm afraid to say, you should be very embarrassed, because West Australian voters are going to hold you accountable.
They're all in bed.
Are going to hold you accountable. These are big projects that make Western Australia very, very successful, that have given West Australian families higher levels of income, higher levels of living than they would have otherwise have had. And in this so-called safeguard mechanism, you are putting that all at risk. Wow. And not yet 12 months of this government. Wow, that is brave.